This episode of Simulation Nation is brought to you by Avkin Incorporated, your one-stop shop for everything standardized patient and wearable simulator.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Simulation Nation Season 2. Very excited to have us back and doing another season of this. We're really excited to cover a lot of different topics this season. I think after last year, we really were able to kind of hone in on a lot of different areas we wanted to discuss, kind of these hot topic things. This year, I feel like we're finally getting a lot of variety of different people who have shown interest in being on the podcast that we can kind of bring in and talk about different topics that you and I aren't necessarily experts in. So yeah. I'm really excited about that.
And we definitely got some feedback from our viewers about, our listeners, I guess it would be, about topics they'd like to see. So if it wasn't our area of expertise or we felt as though somebody could really add to that conversation, we definitely invited a few guests.
Yeah. So just to make sure that you guys know who we are, I'm Megan Weldon. My background was being a standardized patient program director. I was at the university for a very long time, kind of helping with that. I started as a standardized patient and then kind of just moved and ended up in more of a facilitating role. So my expertise really comes from more of the standardized patient perspective, understanding what's the appropriate asks, understanding, just what the role of the standardized patient is, but then also the operation side. And I think that we talk a lot about the operation side from a simulation center as a whole, but when you're running a standardized patient program, there's a whole nother side of operations that isn't talked about a lot. And I think that that's the unique perspective that we get into a lot when it comes to specifically talking about the standardized patient program.
Yeah, and I think my name's Amy Copperthwaite. I am former faculty from the university. I was the one that really kind of thought about how to start an SP program at an affordable way. But I did a lot of those operations early on, didn't realize how important the whole administrative
or what
side
you were
of it
even
was.
doing while you were doing it. I think that that's the other piece is like, it's like we weren't really calling it what it was, but we were just kind of doing it and seeing what happened as we were
the classic building the plane as you're flying.
Well, because we didn't even have ASPE standards at the time. Like when we started everything, there was no standards. There was no even healthcare simulation standards. So it was really just kind of like,
very
well,
early.
Let's see what happens.
For sure. Yep. So my background is healthcare oriented. My, originally I was an emergency department nurse turned simulationist, and then really became passionate about standardized patient methodology and grew that program, and then ended up creating the wearables and starting Avkin out of that.
And just so everybody is aware, too, because I don't think we talk about this on each podcast, and I think maybe only mention it once on season 1. We are mother-daughter, so even though I do have a different last name, I think that was one thing that was like, the people who knew, and the people who didn't know. But just to clarify that, it has been a very funny situation of getting involved, because how this all started was Amy needed a pediatric standardized patient to come in and be an abused child. And
just
rather than
simulation, y'all.
Rather than finding someone else, you're just like, oh, well, you do some acting, like you wanna join in and do it. Yeah. And at the time I was like, oh, well, I could get a little bit of money to do this. This sounds super fun. I was 16, and then basically just came in and then never left, which I think is just kind of funny of.
Yeah, well, that's common for a lot of nurse educators that need standardized patients is, who in my family can I,
who can I draw from for this one?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then another little piece of fun information is you will watch me grow over this season. So I am currently 20 weeks pregnant right now. So by the end of this season, I will be closer to 35 weeks pregnant. So
it's like Simulation Nation baby watch.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Just watch as Megan grows is what this is going to be. But I felt that was important to make sure everyone knew that information.
And it will be my third grandchild, not all Megan's children, but my third grandchild. So I'm pretty excited about that for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. All right, so today we are going to dive deeper into character descriptions. So this is a term that we really coined. This is not something that you find in the general literature. It is not in the standards of best practice, but we do a lot of webinars on this. We have a lot of talks on this, and people are always wanting to know more information about it. And I really feel like this topic could be a master course. We could go for hours with this content. There's so much to dive into. We're going to keep this high level and just make sure that you guys understand the concepts. the purpose behind it. But just understand that there's a lot more that goes into this, and it's not something that you'd be able to find in really in a world outside of Avkin or Megan Weldon or Amy Copperthwaite.
Yeah, or just resources that we've put out there.
Yeah, the resources
really
that are available.
The classic lingo is script, and we really shy away from using that, and there's multiple reasons. I think Megan's going to talk about that with Bethany today. She's going to be our guest speaker.
Yes, we have Bethany McGonigle that's going to be joining us, and she'll be talking more about the theater side and kind of the importance of, as you're training your standardized patients and your actors and things like that, why it's important with your language and what you're including in that information.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So why don't you share a little bit about as you got started, because you did have a theater partner with getting started with this. And like you said, typically in the Aspie world and things like that, we are hearing the term script. And I hear that a lot. And the limitations that I always hear with scripts are, well, we never know what they're going to say. We never know how the simulation's going to go. And as someone who has a lot of experience as a standardized patient, I can assure you, whatever you prepare for in that conversation, it could go a million different ways that you are not anticipating. So when you have that script, it's very limiting. And that's what I've heard consistently of people saying that. So can you share a little bit about kind of the early days of, as you were getting started, what was the difference and how did you know that a character description was more of that angle or the way that you wanted to approach it?
Well, so I would start off by saying that the origin of scripts is, and the origin of standardized patients is really with that OSCE type, really tight testing. And so they knew how they taught health history and physical assessment to their students so they could anticipate which questions were going to come next. And so in a summative type, very tight piece, it may work. We never did that with our graduate students, but it's a potential because it's a very tight, we call it the sandbox, but a very tight and lots of constraints. And
if they go outside of that, then they really aren't following the proper protocol, right? In terms
it has a chance to derail the learning experience, right? And so that you really don't want an SP to derail the learning experience. But in a formative simulation, they could start off first by getting your vital signs, or they could start off by introducing themselves and, beginning with your health history. So it's really important that you are creating a character that this person is going to become. And again, Bethany's here to really talk more about that. But the reason that we really moved towards that was because our early days in simulation, especially, but a majority of our simulations that we did were formative. And when you're doing formative simulation, especially in the early semesters, that you don't know what the students are going to say or do first. So that the person that is the standardized patient must become that individual, become that character, embody the thoughts, because you just never know when they're trying to develop a therapeutic relationship or if they're just trying to do a basic assessment of depression, how they're going to ask the questions or what they're going to say. They have clown shoes on. That's the way we always described it. They're trying to figure out how to do these, take all that they've learned in their didactic classes and apply it in a clinical setting, but obviously in a simulated clinical setting. So that to me was really important, that we were creating the character so that the person that was playing the standardized patient was not trying to guess about how they would answer questions. If they knew who this person was and they understand their motivations and they understood all the what's below the iceberg, essentially, they understood all of that, then what they could do is become that character and represent them no matter what was asked of them or what was done. An interesting backstory on this is that Sam Houston State University is one of our customers at Avkin, and they utilized our simulations with the character descriptions, and the people that were their standardized patients initially were standardized patients that worked in the med school that they basically sent over to the nursing program for certain sims. And as they were integrating these simulations, the standardized patients said, "Hey, could you go back to the med school and give them this basic outline so that they can use it and give us more detail about who this person is, because it really helps us understand it more." And so that really spoke volumes to me, that not just is it good for us as educators to make sure that the standardized patient is prepared for anything along the way, But it was also really good to hear that people that had been a standardized patient in a med school for years, was saying, hey, this is really valuable information. Like, can we bring this into the next? Yeah. They also said that they tried to create their own character description and do a simulation outside of the ones that we had provided. And they said that the standardized patients came back with like 15 or 20 questions that they saw where they had put holes in the character description. So it does take a little bit of work. It does take some time, but they were wise to get feedback from their standardized patients about what other questions should we be including in this.
And so just to clarify here, the character description is a supplement to your simulation. So you have your simulation, and the character description is a piece of this. So it's almost a section of your simulation. That's what you're going to hand off to your standardized patient. This is not something that you're going to give to your learners before they go into simulation. This isn't really for the faculty. This is for the actor who's going to play that role of the standardized patient. And really what it is it goes through the background, it goes through the objectives, it goes through their health history, it goes through their socioeconomic status, it goes through all of these different areas. And the concept there is that you're not giving them line by line what they're supposed to be saying, but that you are giving them who this person is. So in theater, it's very common that people are doing character work. I know that a lot of times people who aren't really in that on the side of things, they think, oh, you get a list of words that you say, and then you go up on stage and you say those words, right? But there's so much background information and exercises that people and actors go through to develop this character work. And that's usually crafted also with a director who's involved in that process of going through that character work. So in theater, it's very common to go through these components. And I think in simulation, that's where we've lacked, is that area of going beyond just here's your words that you need to say, but here's your motivation. And a example I give a lot is that you can have someone who wants to be discharged, right? You can have a patient, let's say 50-year-old male, he wants to go home, right? If you don't tell them why they want to go home, there's very different reasons why. Because if I want to go home to feed my dogs, that's one situation, right? Where, I need to make sure that they're cared for, I feel that way. If you don't have someone to watch your children for you, and you are now in the hospital paying for a babysitter around the clock, you don't have family close by to help you, and basically you are worried that your bank account is draining every single day you're there, and your children are being with people who they don't know. That is a very different motivation than just, I want to get home and feed my dogs and get back to my routine, right? There's two very different motivations. Yeah. And it's important that you're clarifying that so that as a standardized patient, you're not necessarily going to say all of that information, or you may not want them to release all of that information, but you need to give them a point of reference of where they're coming from.
Yeah, it's like a mindset. So if they didn't have health insurance in the U.S., if they didn't have health insurance and they were having to pay for extra days, they just see the dollar signs racking up, right? Yeah. If they had, a parent who had Alzheimer's and they were the primary caretaker, they may be worried that whoever is
they're
there
at
now,
home alone,
caring for them is not doing a good job or whatever. So there's different motivations, but them maybe not verbalizing it, but them being able to understand what the motivator is will help them, again, in that simulation, behave and respond the way the patient would. And I think, again, motivations are really, really important.
Yeah. And I think that the key there is that as you're getting into these character descriptions, there might be a lot of information that feels irrelevant to the situation. So going into some of our earlier days, one of the simulations that we did was an interprofessional simulation with PT and nursing. And we had a college-age student who was in the hospital because they had blunt force trauma to their left leg, and they were starting to feel warmth and pain in their right leg, and they weren't sure why. So the whole goal of the simulation was just basically that the PT students were identifying that there was concern for a DVT, and they didn't want to get the patient up and ambulated and going to physical therapy yet until they had confirmed that it was not a DVT. So really, in terms of the standardized patient and how we wanted them to react, respond, there really wasn't a right or wrong way. It was just more like, no, we just want you to receive this information and be a part of the conversation of what's going on. So at the end of the semester, the character description that we had was very basic. Again, not a lot of information, kind of just you were walking down the street, you got attacked, you were hit in the left leg, you're a college student, you want to get back because it's finals week coming up. Really, that was it. There wasn't much else there. And so when we got to the end of the semester and we were starting to debrief on our simulations and we were going over this one, we got a specific comment that said, why are some standardized patients are reacting upset and they'll get emotional and they'll start to cry. So the character description was very basic. The standardized patients weren't given a lot of information. On there, it just said, you were walking down the street, you were attacked, that happened to your left leg, you're now in the hospital, you want to get back because finals week's coming up. But other than that, there really wasn't much information. And the other piece that was really missing that we have in all of our character descriptions now is the interaction guidelines, which really walk through how you should react when certain things are coming up, like pivotal moments in the simulation. And we didn't have that. So when we got to the end of the semester and we were kind of debriefing on the simulation, we got the comment asking, well, why is it that some of the standardized patients are reacting emotional and they're getting upset and they're getting sad that they're, not able to go home or they're not able to start physical therapy? Some react like, okay, no problem, see you tomorrow, no big deal. And then other people are getting upset and angry that, they want to get back to finals week and they're already behind and they don't want to be here and all these other pieces. Yeah, more argumentative in the sim. And when that was brought to me as the SP educator, I said, well, because there's no information in the character description, you're not telling them how you want them to react. So they're just reacting how they would naturally react in real life. So if this is something that would be information that they'd be frustrated by, and maybe they lean more towards that, that's how they're going to react and respond. If they would be more emotional and more upset, that's how they're going to react and respond. If they see this as like, yeah, it's no big deal, I'll get out of the hospital when I get out of the hospital. And that all ties back to that standardized patient's own history and experience in healthcare and all these other things. So when you're not giving them that information, when you're not telling them how you want them to react and respond, it can be all over the place. And at times, you don't have to craft every detail. That's why we say it's not a script. You don't need to have every single thing planned out of how you want them to react and respond. They have the ability to make some choices the same way actors in movies and things like that have some freedom to be able to make choices. But in these pivotal moments of the trajectory of the simulation and meeting the objectives, you do need to make sure that you are giving very clear and direct information, even if you don't think it's relevant to the simulation. Even if you think this is not something that is important, I don't care if they react upset or angry or neutral, it doesn't matter to me. You just need to pick one lane so that you're having standardization across the board and that some learners aren't interacting with someone who's combative while other learners are interacting with someone they're trying to console while others are just walking out of the room because the patient's like, all right, cool, I'll see you tomorrow. You just want to make sure that whatever it is, it's standardized because the same way that we would expect that of all of our simulations, you can standardize SP simulation. And I think that's something we get all the time is people coming back saying, well, when I add that other person in the room, I don't know how they're going to react. I don't want it to go off the rails. And there's all this concern for it. But all the time, I just lead people back to you've got to follow standards best practice and have a well-written character description, and you're not going to have those same problems. When you're implementing training and you're implementing all of these different things that we're supposed to do inside of SP simulation, you don't have those same concerns of standardized patients going off the rails and not feeling like you have control of what's going on. But we're going to bring Bethany in, and she's going to share more from that actor side, again, this theater background component of how you approach character and characterization and basically what we can learn from the theater world and bring it into the simulation world. All right, so we are here with Bethany McGonigle, and she's going to share more of the theater side as we kind of get into the pieces of character descriptions and being able to really do a well-defined character. So can you introduce yourself, give a little bit of your background?
Yeah, so my name is Bethany. My degree is in musical theater. I work a lot with kind of SPs. I've been at SP since I was 13 years old, and I've done a lot of SP work. And then I also work on training SPs, and I kind of live in that kind of world.
Yeah, so you really do a great job of being able to talk about the background of theater and then how that comes into simulation. And I think that in the world of theater, oftentimes it's hard to understand all of the different words and all of the different pieces to it, right? Because there are so many different theories and approaches and things like that. So people who are coming from simulation, who have a background in nursing and things like that, we don't really understand all of those different components. And I know for me, even with having some conversations with people in theater, I can get lost very easily. And I feel like I even lean more towards the theater side, but I still, like, there's just pieces where they can get into it and I'm like, I don't even know what we're talking about. So can you kind of break down in an easy way to understand that what is the process when you are kind of approaching a new character, or again, thinking about even removed from simulation, but thinking about as you're approaching something on stage, if you're given a script, your approach isn't just, well, I'm going to look at these words and add some emotion. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So what are the different pieces that go beyond just memorization in terms of developing a character?
Absolutely. So there's a lot that goes into a character. And every actor has a different process for how they choose to create the character. So there's something called physicality, which I talk about a lot, but it's basically just like how you physically hold yourself. So right now we're very relaxed, we're leaning back, but if I were to sit ramrod straight, that obviously sends a very different message. So physicality is how you hold yourself and what that says about the character. Whenever we're approaching a character, it's really nice in plays and musicals because it's usually a longer snapshot of their life, whereas sim, it's like one moment of their life.
Yeah.
But in creating that character, you always need to think about the life of the character, right? So it's like, how did they get to this point in time? What made them this way? What made them respond to things the way that they are?
So if you were going to approach physicality through a character description, right? So if I was trying to teach someone who didn't have a background in theater, right? I can't just put in there work through physicality, right? You know, that's not, you know, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But so if you were going to approach it, how would you write it? If again, let's say you did want the patient to, let's approach it from a very small perspective, right? They didn't feel good about themselves. They didn't have confidence. They weren't someone who was bolsterous, right? They're a smaller person. How would you approach that in terms of getting that point across so that you could see it where you're kind of giving the direction of physicality without just being like, do physicality?
Yeah. I think the biggest point is asking the SP or the actor is how would they want to be perceived, right? So if we're talking about someone who wants to be small, who wants to be, you know, maybe has, you know, some kind of like depression or anxiety, they want to be as small as possible. I would give that note to the SP of like, you want to not be seen right now. If you could not be in the room, that's ideal. If you could vanish into thin air. So it's like you're going to want to curl in your shoulders. You're going to want to, you know, be very cognizant of your arm. Usually there's something, it's called like shadow movement, where it's just called like an unconscious movement. So it's like
almost like a twitch.
Yeah, like so like me rubbing my sleeve is something I do to comfort myself, or twirling my ring. You know, what is their movement that's what they depend on?
Yeah. So maybe in the character description, it would be writing out physically.
Yeah.
You are going to curl your shoulders in. You are going to be kind of slumped to one side. You are going to fidget with the sheets while you're sitting in bed. But writing those components out and then taking it a step further in the training process of then giving them that background. And I know from my own experience, and I don't know if you agree with this, but my own experience has been that even if I'm working with an SP, some people can take it from the side of, you want to vanish, you don't want to be in the room. Some people need, I need you to be inward. I need you to move your arms, and I need you to cross your legs. I need you to be, you know, and so some people take it from a literal standpoint of this is what I need you to do. And then some people need to take it from an emotional standpoint of, if you could disappear right now, you would.
Yeah, and those are two different approaches as an actor. So it's called outside in or inside out.
Okay.
But basically,
like
it's
the
just,
movie, like the Disney movie.
like the Disney movie. But it's TM. But it's basically like some people are going to get it when you say you want to just vanish because they're an inside out thinker. And some people it's going to be like, no, you want to curl in your shoulders. You want to, you know, cross your legs. That's going to be the outside in approach. So it's just giving those, both of those are very helpful to your SP because whichever they are, however they process is going to click with them.
See, that's the part that I think is so funny with this stuff is it's like in simulation. And again, I don't have the degree in theater and things like that. But it's so funny because it's like in my head, I'm just like, yeah, two people, like they just approach it differently. And then you're like, yes, that has actually been well thought out in the theater world. We have terms for that. Here are those terms. That's what it is. If you'd like to Google it, it'll give you more information.
If you'd like to Google it.
But I think that that's the funny piece is like in sim, I think a lot of times we're trying to like rewrite the story, right? Like we're trying to find it. Like if you think of blocking, we always called it when we were doing our thing of you make choices, right? And so in that it was like you make a choice, but it's also the blocking of the technicality, right? Where we'd say your cameras are here, so you can't go into this, black place because I can't see anything that's happening through there. So it's funny to me though, where in sim, I think that we just don't see it as those terms. But it's those terms, right? Blocking is the way that you move around the room.
Yep.
And we have those guidelines in the different rooms of what they are. We just don't call it blocking.
Yeah.
Or, again, that kind of concept,
it's
right?
kind of like reinventing the wheel, but the wheel's already been made.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
And it's a lot easier just to go look over
at the wheel.
and copy the wheel. Okay, so we talked about physicality. What are some of the other components of how you would be approaching a new character that you're doing?
So the next thing that I would kind of do is I would look at the family that this person grew up in, and I'd look at who they're surrounded by. So this is kind of like who's their support person, right? Who's the person that if they're having a really crappy day, who are they going to call? Do they have anyone to call? And I kind of look at that factor. Are they close to their mom? Are they close to their sister? Because everyone tends to think of like, we have the same mom, but if I were to say what my mom is to me, that's different than what your mom is to you. So everyone has a different perception of family and what a family member means to them. So I try to think about, for this character, what does their support look like? What does their family look like? And who do they have around them to depend on?
Yeah, and that's we do have that in all of our character descriptions that we have, because that was how I approached it as well, was even if the family is not in the sim, this person still needs to know who their support system is. Like you said, do they have someone to call? And I will say, I steer clear in sim of trying to make it where it's like they have nobody. Like even if it's just a friend, like at least then that gives you something to go off as the actor. I think when you're like, you just have no one, it's very hard, especially people who come from a situation where you do have support systems, to imagine having no support system, right? So like, let's say you were in foster care and like that is a harder mindset or understanding to get in. Do you feel that way even from like a on stage performance, that someone who like, it's so different from yourself that it is still hard to be able to identify?
It is. It's getting yourself in a completely different headspace is what it is. And I mean, part of it is that when you're creating a character, you can look to things that you have in your life that you can connect to, right? So if they have a sister that I'm very close to as my character, I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that feels like. I know what that is. And so if they have no one, or if it's very isolated, the character, it just completely cutting off any ties that I've known through my life. And then it's like, okay, now let me, it sounds kind of, hippie, but it's like sitting in a room and like, okay, what would it be like if I genuinely if I got hurt, if I broke my leg and I had no one to call? What does that look like?
What does that feel like?
Exactly. It's like, what is being in the hospital? It's like you don't have an emergency contact. What is that like? Like that must just be crazy. It's so different. So yeah.
I do think that having, in terms of support and thinking about your characters in the simulations that you do, I do think that that is an important component, to think that you do want to create different people, right? And don't steer clear of having people who are different than your actors. They can be different. And again, you can push people into a lot of different areas. But being able to have something to draw back on. I remember that I did a sim that specifically she didn't have a good relationship with her mom. Like her and her mom were like oil and vinegar. Or oil and water. They just didn't get along. And obviously, like me personally, I don't relate to that. My mom is my support system. So that is not something. But her dad, she was super close to her dad, and then her dad moved. So for me, it was more of me thinking like, okay, if my mom suddenly moved when I was 20 years old to go have a boyfriend in a different state, what would that feel like? And so even though it's a different level of like, okay, I'm kind of taking this concept and, twisting it over here, at least you have something to go off of. But it is that concept of being like, no emergent, like you have no one, you've never had anybody.
And yeah.
That's, I think, harder.
And it does take some acting chops. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like a lot of SPs, like, as I feel like people who use SPs knows, they're not always actors, right? Like, it's not always that they're coming from an acting background. So creating a character that you can more lean on as from personal experience or the general population's experience is easier to play than someone who's completely, again, something like that, someone who's completely isolated.
Yeah. And I think just thinking through that as you're writing the character descriptions is just a good piece to add in here of, like, you can still get that same dramatic feeling that you want. It just doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that far on the spectrum, right?
It could still be like you have a friend.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Just someone. Yeah.
I think that's all great. So can you talk a little bit more about the Uta Hagen approach? Because I know that this is something that you've really kind of honed in terms of writing character descriptions and kind of that approach to it. And obviously, like we've already talked about, we're rewriting the wheel, but the wheel's already done. Like it's that concept of like, we're starting from scratch, but we're really not because other people have done it. And I think the theory of Uta Hagen, which is actually somebody's name, just so everybody knows, because I know when I first heard this, I did not realize that was a person, but it is a person. And basically, she developed questions to ask to help you work through who this person is. So again, if you were to get a new script, working through these different pieces, and so can you just share a little bit more about that approach and kind of how that translates to character descriptions?
Yeah, so Uta Hagen was a German-American actress, and basically she taught a lot of classes in New York. It's what she's most famous for. She has a book, which actually has two, but first book is called Respect for Acting. And in that book, it talks about 9 different questions. So it's if you're approaching a character, you want to answer these 9 different questions. And those, like the first one is, who am I? And usually when you're answering these questions, you don't want to go for the most basic of answers. So if I were to say, who am I? It's like, well, my name is Bethany McGonigle. That's the answer. It's like, no, you want to go deeper than that.
Yeah.
So it's like you want to, whenever you're answering the questions, you want to try to go as deep as possible. They work really well for simulation because they work specifically with scene acting. So, like, it's what surrounds me. What time of day is it right now? So it's very different.
It's that moment in time.
Exactly. It kind of captures that one moment, but it gives the depth of the life of the character, which is what's really nice.
Yeah.
So the 9 questions that she has, it really goes through different aspects of the scene and allows you to really get into depth about where you are and why you're there and how you're feeling and what your tactic is going to be to try to achieve what you want.
Yeah. I think the cool part with it, too, is really if you think of it like an iceberg. Because, again, what they're seeing inside of the sim, what they're seeing from the character, is really just the tip of the iceberg. But as you go through the Uta Hagen questions and really, again, dive deeper, you have to push yourself to dive deeper. But as you dive deeper, you kind of start to create that iceberg that's all under the water that helps make that top part authentic, realistic, again, believable. But it's because you have so much depth in that iceberg that's what's really adding to the piece that they see.
And that's what makes good acting. Like, if we're to really sum it up, make it as basic as possible, good acting is you're only seeing that tip of the iceberg. You're seeing that one moment of the character, but there's so much more underneath it. So that's what makes the difference between like a Hallmark movie and like a Joaquin Phoenix movie. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that's...
Well, I think of it too, and I know how much you love Meryl Streep and as much as I love Meryl Streep, but it's like you think of Devil Wears Prada.
Yeah.
Think about how many words Meryl Streep says in Devil Wears Prada, right? Number one, there's so much physicality in terms of how she moves and how she operates as a person. Yeah. But I'm sure that there's stuff out there about this, but how many words she says, but how much of a point she can get across of who that person is. And I think that's the other, again, beauty of what you're saying there in terms of you don't have to use words. You don't have to, there's so much you can use in good acting to get that across. Now, a lot of that does come from those character descriptions of adding the depth, and then you do have to have the acting chops to be able to carry it forward, but it is the piece of making sure you have the motivations, making sure that you really understand who that person is, and then that's what's going to get these emotions across and create. I always say too that I like it with the energy in the room. I always will put that in character descriptions. What do I want the energy in the room to feel like? Yeah. Do I want it to feel depressed so that when someone's walking in the room, it's like, I'm getting hit with low energy right now? Do I want it to feel chaotic where they walk in the room and they're like, which way is up right now? Like, what are we, like, how do I even address you right now? But feeling the energy in the room, I think that's another piece that I don't know if it misses, because some people are in the control room and they may not feel it the same way you're in the room. But I could go through almost any sim I've ever done, and I could give you one word to explain the energy that I feel in the room as the actor, and that I'm trying to create for anyone walking into the room when they're coming into that simulation, because I want the energy of me, of who I am as the patient, to hit them like a brick wall when they walk in. Like, I want to control that, and I want it to be an instant, whatever it is, right? Because it could be anything, but I want there to be instant. Like, so I think of one where they walk in and I'm supposed to be in like 10 out of 10 pain for that simulation. When they walk in, I want them to feel urgent. I want them to feel there's a sense of urgency, and they have to act. So that then that creates the sense of, oh, I have to get this PVC pet set up, which is what the part of the very first part of the sim was. But they have to get set up in a very quick amount of time. That creates an urgency that if I wasn't acting in 10 out of 10 pain, or I didn't have this background to understand it all, it doesn't create an urgency, right? Because it's just like, oh, yeah, my back hurts, like, but it's very different than if you're in 10 out of 10 pain and you're screaming and you're upset and you've had a history of it, blah, blah, blah. It creates that, right?
Yeah. And I will just say, like, something to lean on here is the natural human reaction. Like, when you're screaming, if someone is screaming, your natural instinct is, especially as a nurse, right, is to let me help this person.
Anyone in healthcare, let me help this person.
Yeah. And so it's like when I've done simulations like that, it's like naturally I have people who, grab my hand and they use touch and stuff like that. So as an actor, it's how do you want the natural human response to be? What would you respond to? An urgency or chaos? Like, what would make you feel that when you walked in the room? So when you're creating character descriptions, that's what I would really challenge you to think, is how would you feel? What would make you feel that way that you want your sim to feel?
Yeah, and I think that students pick up on that, right? And then the students are going to react similarly. Yeah. So just one thing that I wanted to touch on, because I think that it's such a good testament to going through the Uta Hagen questions, and we will have this as a free resource in the show notes. So if you guys are interested in learning more about those questions and really breaking them down, you can go on there and view those. But we were going through this exercise because we've been doing this at some of our events. And so for our Sim Summits, we've been going through and challenging people to either go through a TV character or a simulation that they already have and go through the Uta Hagen questions and be able to kind of go through that mindset of, where am I, what time is it, what surrounds me, those different pieces. And Crystal Farina, who's actually going to come in a little bit, and we're going to interview her on a different episode of Simulation Nation. She was talking about how she was doing this off of a character that they had done for a long time. This was a character that they had who was low economic status and things along those lines, and felt very alone in those times. After going through the question, she shared kind of as her feedback was, I've been doing this sim for so long, and I never thought of it from this perspective. I never saw this character this way. I've only seen them coming from, they're in a bed in a healthcare situation. And I think that that's what speaks to it so much is we have to, in simulation, view these people as their life. It is their history. It is who they are. You are a full person with full motivations and all these different pieces. If we look at people as just the illness or the disease or that moment in time, we are not adding the humanity into our simulations. Where when we're adding in the depth of who this person is, and I think that that's something I really care about when I'm writing my characters, is that it's like I really want there to be these relatable topics. Yeah. So if I'm writing a character, and let's say they are seeking more pain medication because they are addicted to opioids, right? Like, if that's the situation, I'm not just going to put in there they've stolen from their family, they have no relationship with anybody, because that's not who the average person is. Yeah. They have dreams, they have goals, they have all of these different pieces, and they at one point probably did have a family who they loved and care about, and they're probably really would want that relationship again, but they don't know how to go back. But adding all of those layers in where you're just like, oh, I feel for this person. Yeah. I get them. I understand them. Because I think that that's the other piece too, is that writing characters, especially from a very blanket statement, it's like they're good, they're bad. Yeah. And that's not who people are, right?
Not at all.
People are so complex. There's so much there that adding in these different elements to make them complex, where it's like they can have these very redeeming qualities. They can be very charismatic. They can be very easy to talk to, but they may still be addicted to opioids, right?
Yeah.
And so there's just these layers of being able to add in those components that I think we often miss because we keep it very one-sided opposed to approaching it as complex people. And I think that that's the beauty in these different theater tactics that we could include in simulation is theater has always approached it that way, right? Theater has never approached it as here's your bad person, here's your good person, and that's it. You know, even the villains have complex stories,
No
right?
one sees himself as a villain.
No one,
No
that's
one-
so great, yeah.
No one wakes up and goes, I'm going to be a villain today.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
That never happens.
I'm the bad person here.
Exactly.
Yeah, they always have their reasons and things like that. But I mean, even looking at like the story of Wicked, right? Like again, it's the concept of like, oh, what's the other side here that we're missing? But having those pieces to it, I think that's where again you just get to that beauty of it. Where I think that's so great. It's like no one sees themselves as the villain. No one sees themselves as the person who's approaching it. And when you write it from that mindset, that's where you're going to start to have challenges. But if you write it from the complexity mindset.
And it'll be the challenges that they'll actually encounter, right?
Yeah.
Because again, it's reflecting life. In life, no one is one-sided. No one is good or bad. Everyone is mixed.
Yeah.
So it really is like you're preparing your students more for what they will see in life because no one is going to actually be a one-sided character. So giving them a complex character where they are innately human, you're going to see that reflected.
Yeah, I think that's so great and such a good point because it's as you get deeper into it and you can really then go into the debriefing where they say, oh, I really felt for this person and I really, you know, like I really had this or I had this, but they wouldn't take their medication, so I don't know how to help them because they won't do, you know, that is life, right? That is the natural tendency. And so I think that making sure that we're reflecting that in our characters and viewing it that way is great. So I really appreciate you being here. This has been great to be able to get this perspective and this side of things. Like I said, we will have the resource of Uta Hagen in the show notes. So again, feel free to grab that, click on it, and work through it. We also have a free simulation on avkin.com if you want to download that and scroll down and then look at the character description. That will give you all of the pieces that we have and being able to see an example of it. It may actually help with this. If you are writing character descriptions and need that theater touch or need a little help, please feel free to reach out. These are the kinds of things that we love to talk about and go into more detail about. So if there is more information that you have. But thank you so much, Bethany. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so we just finished up our conversation with Bethany, which was just so insightful for me. I think, again, even doing this for a long time, but then just being able to sit down with that kind of like expert who understands that language. I was just saying off air, but having these things that in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, this is just something that we do or how I approach it. And she's like, oh yeah, here's the theater term for that. We've been doing that for hundreds of years. And it's like, oh, okay.
Right.
Maybe I should Google that and learn a little bit more about it from the experts who have done it. But I think that that's so important for us in simulation is to continue to learn and again, kind of be open-minded that there are people who have gone before us and kind of understand this in the world of theater. And the more we can understand them and their approaches, it's the more realistic simulation's going to get.
Yeah, it's truly an interprofessional experience.
It really
right?
is, yeah.
But I will also say that because we actually taught a course and students, undergraduate students could enroll in the course, we had a lot of pre-med students taking this course and a lot of nursing program, a lot of pre-physical therapy or pre-dentistry or whatever. And what they walked away with from the SP perspective was a whole lot more empathy and a whole lot more understanding about how actually the different disciplines work not only independently but also together.
Yeah.
So they walked into their med school interviews with so much more of a leg up. They had something to talk about that made them unique. So again, there's
Well,
so much
and-
we can learn from each other in this.
And bringing it back to the concept of character descriptions, the complexity of the patients they're taking care of. And I know you've told this story before, and I'm going to say it again, and correct me if I'm butchering it here, but we did have a nursing student who was going through and was playing the role of a standardized patient. Now, that does take some extra finagling there, but she was able to go through it as a standardized patient. And she said at the very end of taking the course in her experience, she said, you know, on any simulation, my character description is, you know, between 1 to 3 pages, right? And when I do a given sim, so one sim with one set of students, they might get to a third of the information that I'm giving. She said, it makes me wonder what I'm missing with my own patients.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the beauty of it, is that you're really highlighting the complexity of the patients they're taking care of. Yeah. And if anything, if it just instills that natural curiosity of who it is that they're taking care of and wanting to go deeper, going to quote Bethany here in the terms of nobody sees themselves as the villain, but going in and saying, okay, let's get deeper into their motivations. I mean, again, I think that imagine what world we'd live in if that could be every healthcare provider's perspective of going in, of a natural curiosity, right? In terms of communication, empathy, advocacy, all of that, right? It could change so much if that's what, at the end of it, we're instilling, right?
That's the heart of it.
Yeah. All right. So as we wrap up here, I really would like to hear from you, just from your approach of character descriptions. If you could kind of go back, or if you were giving advice to kind of your early self, what are some of the pieces that you would, maybe roadblocks you experienced along the way?
Well, I think the biggest one, and I saw this repeated over and over again as other people started to write simulations, as our graduate faculty and things. The way that the template, the character description template is structured is almost like a history and physical. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that you're filling it out almost like you would be filling out a health assessment or a health history. And so you have a tendency to get yourself back into, back into medical jargon. Mm-hmm. And so you might be putting, 40 pack year history under the social history, but in actuality, you need to say that this patient has smoked a pack a day for the last 40 years, or whatever it is, or 2 packs a day for the last 20 years, because they don't know what a 20 pack year history is.
Yeah.
And so that would be my biggest piece, is to check and recheck and make sure there's no medical jargon in there. You can even ask people that are not medically oriented to read any of it, and to find out if there's anything in there that, though it sounds perfectly normal to you, you just don't see it or hear it.
One thing that's common is to put denies smoking or denies drinking. And from a layperson who doesn't have a healthcare background, it sounds like you're saying you deny this, but you're actually doing it.
Yeah,
so it's like kind of like,
example.
hey, you're lying. You're lying about this. Yeah. And that really changes the sim. If I'm going in, I'm like, wow, I'm lying about smoking. I'm lying about drinking. I'm doing all these things in the background, but I'm going to tell them I'm not.
Right.
That changes it versus you
that
don't
changes
smoke,
the internal
you don't
motivations.
drink. Right? That's a very different thing that comes out of it.
Yeah, so that would be my number one. My number two is that when you are doing it, I mentioned having an SP read for medical jargon, but also if you are doing, let's say, someone who's a 70-year-old and you aren't of that age demographic, having them read through it to say, this makes sense. I spent a lot of time writing a character description only to take it to someone who was of, older than I was, a generation older than I was, and she said, I wouldn't say it or do it that way at all.
Exactly.
And so then you spend all this time rewriting it. So having them alongside you or guiding you, I think is really important.
You do not need to be the expert on every single person. And I will say that especially from different communities, right? Thinking about people who are very different from you, our perception of people who are, let's say, identify as non-binary, right? We have a lot of ideas in our head of what that might look like. It's so different in real life. And so actually bringing in different people from those backgrounds to say, hey, is this actually your experience? Is this actually, do you actually feel this way, or things like that? Now, again, mind you, everyone's going to be different because everyone has different backgrounds, different experiences with it. But also just being able to say, I just want to make sure this is accurate and I'm getting different perspectives on it, I think is huge. I say it all the time, but before I became a mom, I used to play a pediatric mom a lot. And then when I became a mom, I was like, I need to rewrite every character description I've ever done about being a mom, because once you've gone through it, you're like, oh, it's so different. Like, you're just so tired. You're just trying to get through the day. Like, it's a completely different experience.
It's amazing what those little ones will do to you,
right?
when
you're like, oh, this is so different. Because I remember always thinking like, oh no, as the mom, you're going to know exactly when they ate last. You're going to know exactly when you changed their diaper last. You're going to know exactly how many wet diapers they had. And I was like, there's no way. As a brand new mom, like, now again, there will be some, right, if you wanted to play up the more anxious mom or something like that. But there is no way that if I went into a doctor's office and they asked me those 7 questions, I'd be able to be like, rattle them off right in. I'd have a general idea, but like, I'm not going to know down to the minute, right? And so it's just those kinds of situations too, once you're going through and you're like, oh no, how did I feel? Oh yeah, no, that's not it, right? And then
I think,
going back.
Yeah, and I think the other big thing of this is that you are using actual experiences from your own personal clinical background, or you are tapping into a subject matter expert's personal interest. We did a psychotic break simulation, and we were told over and over again by the students that it was not a realistic simulation. But thankfully, I always had psych faculty there with me, and I'd say, is this a realistic, patient presentation? They're like, absolutely. Yeah. So, and a funny story is that we had one of our SPs who went on to med school, and we just saw her at IMSH, and she said, those psych break simulations where they said it was too, like, over the top? She's like, that's nothing.
Yeah, she was like, those were at a 2. I could have given you a 10. She's like, you want to rewrite those sims to be more dramatic.
So, of course, we made sure that the nursing students were not injured, and
everything
SPs
was safe.
So we worked really hard at that, but I do think that it's really, conceptually, you need to be drawing on clinical experiences that are relevant, and it will keep that drama out of it. The soap opera kind of melodrama that you have in there. And then the last piece that I would say, from a perspective of someone who's in healthcare that worked really hard to build the SP program and write these character descriptions, is that if you at all can involve the theater program, if you find someone, the person that you're looking for at your institution is someone who's interested in applied theater. So if you call and you are getting a secretary, ask for who the specialty is, or maybe you can find it on the faculty information. But applied theater is basically theater off the stage. So, that's who our partner in theater was not necessarily, that wasn't their expertise, but they were innovative and willing to take a step in a direction that they weren't expecting. Yeah. But having them, I gained such an appreciation and respect for the theater department and what they brought. And then the theater department also gained such respect for what we do in healthcare. And we saw that loud and clear through the self-reflections that we had our standardized patients write and understanding. But from my perspective, I think those are the things that I would walk away. If I could walk away with anything to a younger me, those are the things that I would say for the most part. Yeah. And all the wonderful things that Bethany shared with us as well.
Yeah, I think that the concept of not only getting a theater partner, but also even just auditing a theater course. Like Bethany had mentioned, that simulation really ties closely with scene work and being able to do a scene and focusing in on that snapshot. Even if you're just to do that, I think you'd walk away with so much information in terms of what you're looking at. So even thinking there, and again, like we talked about with the interview with Bethany,
you could recruit some students while you're there.
Exactly. You could also find some people, make some friends. But I think Bethany really highlighted that there is so much out there in the theater world. We just don't know the right terms to search. And I think that being able to kind of start getting out there and really putting yourself out there to try to understand, you'll find a lot of natural correlation with your simulations and what you can gain from
there's
that.
some new research out on it as well. Really cool stuff.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Simulation Nation. I know we chatted for a long time today, but that's what happens when you get us talking about character descriptions. So we will have that resource in the notes that will share more about those Uta Hagen questions, as well as if you want to visit avkin.com. We do have a simulation there where you can download that and review the character description already filled out. And like we said, if you guys have any questions, want to talk about your character descriptions, leave it in the comments. We love to talk about it.